Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just thrilled to see both our students here as well as members of the community, as well as those of you who have followed Chris's career. So I'm just thrilled to see all of you. Welcome to Wheaton College. My name is Emily Langen. I'm an associate professor of communication, and I'm thrilled to host Chris on our campus for earlier today as well as for this evening with us. Just a little bit of an introduction as to who Chris is. There it is. Chris is the head of the research library for NFL Films. If you're unfamiliar, NFL Films is a subsidiary of the NFL. And so his job there is as a researcher for them and for the various creative projects and productions that the NFL does. He's written numerous books, particularly on the early pioneers of the game. He comes to football as a native lover, a four-time letter winner himself in football as a wide receiver at Urbana University. He's an Ohio native, but his career has taken him for the last 2 decades to New Jersey to work at NFL Films. Most of you are likely very familiar that Red Grange is a Wheaton native, which brings him to our campus a few years ago, 2016. Spent a few weeks here going through the multiple materials that are held by our special collections. A special thanks to our library and our special collections, some of which is here tonight. I hope you have a chance, if you haven't yet, to go back and see some of the things that Sarah Stanley has brought from the special collections, including, of course, his number 77 jersey, which is terribly fun to have it with us. There are literally boxes, 500 or so more pieces of memorabilia that is held here by the college that was in the Red Grange collection, of which that brought Chris to campus and deciding to do the book launch here. His background, as I said, is 25 years as a researcher for NFL Films. But the other thing, of course, is to say as a creative producer, he's a 2016 Emmy winner for the series Hard Knocks on the NFL. That's his contemporary view, but he's here tonight to speak about Red Grange and the historic legacy of the NFL. So please welcome with me Chris Willis.
Can you hear me? Okay. I first want to thank Wheaton College, Dr. Langland, for inviting me and the communications department. It's a thrill to be here at Wheaton College, and especially in Wheaton, because this is where sort of Red sort of grew up and sort of went to high school, and his family was here. So it's sort of a real pleasure and treat to be here to talk to you about Red. Like Dr. Langland mentioned, I did spend over a week here, going through the special collections, library. If you have some free time and you want to look through 50 boxes and check out some material in Red, they have tons of very good information that was real helpful, especially for me in this project. So I enjoyed going through that material because as a biographer, you look for those type of things to find. Oral history is always great. Like for me and Red, there was some footage, not a lot, from the 20s that was shot of him playing. But to be able to go through that type of material and to be able to have to preserve that is always nice, especially for a researcher to be able to find some of that stuff. And especially for Red, because Red has been documented, fairly detailed at some times in his life. To be able to find new material or new things that show what type of person he was or what he was going through, is always a thrill. Oh wait, I didn't know about that, or nobody's covered this. This gives a little bit more detail on his life. So, like she said, there was over 50 boxes, and I actually kept tabs because when I started doing research, 20 years ago, I'm a big copy guy. Trees probably dislike me very much, because I always like to have a copy of something. Like, okay, here's the information. I'm not, but in this day and age, with scanning being much easier and libraries moving towards that a little bit, I actually kept track of all the I had over 1,200 scans of documents that I end up, because I didn't want to miss anything. I didn't want to just, write stuff down or take notes. I'm like, I just started scanning things. So it just made it much easier to go through the material and stuff. So I always wrote that number down. So, But being in Wheaton is a thrill, because this is where Red spent a lot of his time. When you retrace somebody's life, going to where they were and what they did is always a key. So for Red, his journey actually started in Forksville, Pennsylvania. That's where he was born. That's where his father and his mother were living. He was born in the woods of Sullivan County, and he was there in Forksville. And so he had a tragedy early in his life. His mother, unfortunately, had a bad toothache and had this is 1910, and dentistry was not at the level it is now, and she had a toothache that she had removed, and she ended up hemorrhaging, and she caught pneumonia and did not survive, and she was, I think she was 39 years old when she passed away. So Lyle Grange, Red's father, had Red, Garland, and two of his sisters, So he had 4 children, and his wife just passed away. So he's like, "What do I do?" Well, most of Lyle's siblings were living here in Wheaton, here in DuPage County. He had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters that were living in here who kind of migrated west. And since he had lost his wife, most of his family, he wasn't there. He's like, "Well, I need to be closer to family. I need some help. I have 4 children that are all pretty much under the age of 12, I think 13 years old." So that's how Red's family got here to Wheaton, and they would spend most of their lives here, and this is where Red grew up. So some of the streets that you walk, some of the parks that you might see, Red Grange walked those same streets and those same parks, and sort of, this is where he grew up. Which was a different environment than maybe today. If you go to school here, I believe there's over 50,000 people in Wheaton right now. Well, there was barely 3,500 people at that time when he moved here. So it was definitely a much smaller environment for Red to grow up in. But he really enjoyed it, because he was so young. He was 6 years old, in Pennsylvania in the woods. Everything was spread out. There wasn't as many kids that he was friends with. So he moves here, even though it was only 3,500. Everything was so close together. You had the business district, you had the schools, and so he got to get involved with some of the sports that he eventually loved. That was one thing he always was quoted with in some of his interviews is he only went to school just because he was almost regulated to go to school. He enjoyed the sports after classes, with his friends, whether it was baseball, basketball, football, and track. He did every sport. Nowadays, some kids only specialize in one sport, but back then he wanted to play any sport. Whatever the season was. In the fall it was football, winter was basketball, spring was track, summer was baseball, and he loved doing all the sports in this city. So some of the connections with Red continued through high school. At the time there was really only one high school. It was Wheaton Central High School, which he attended. And his legacy there as an athlete, he played all 4 sports. He lettered all 4 years in all 4 sports. So he ended up with 16 letters. Even as a freshman, he was very good. And he tells a story when he went out for as a freshman. He talked to the varsity coach, and he asked the varsity coach, he's like, "Oh, what position do you need?" Which was probably smarter than the average freshman. And the coach was like, "Oh, well, we have everybody, but we don't have an end." And Red said, "No, I play end." So instead of having the coach tell him which position, or, "Oh, hey, we got backfield players or receivers, or linemen," he said, "No, I'm an end." So he actually started as a freshman as an end. And I think it helped him down the line. Obviously, if you know a little bit about Red's career, he was mainly the first breakaway running back, in football. Like football at that time was what we call 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Everything was kind of played at the line of scrimmage. It was a lot of running. There wasn't a lot of passing, in those days. So I think as a freshman, when he played in, he learned how to block. He learned line play a little bit more, how the backs sort of run off his blocks and stuff like that. So when he moved the halfback is, his sophomore year at Wheaton Central, I think he knew a little bit more about how the line blocks him, and then, he was famous for those sort of end runs. He would hit the corner, and because he was just faster than everybody, he would outrun him. If if you look at some of his stats and some of his games, they're just ridiculous in high school. You know, I don't know if this team was just so much better, he was just so much better, but he would score almost 4 or 5 touchdowns a game, especially in his junior and senior year. I mean, it would just, some of the scores were like 75-0 and 52-0, and it just was amazing, you know, what they were doing, you know, with him as a back, you know, and stuff like that. So I'm going to read. There'll be a few times I think I'm just going to read a short passage in some of the books, and one of the things I liked about Red that I wanted to present here is to find a lot of interviews that he did and quotes that he said. You know, it's okay for me as a historian to interpret what I think and to say, but a lot of times it's his words, you know, throughout the book that sort of describes how he feels and what he was doing. And if you know Wheaton a little bit, they played on a football field that was called the Orchard, which was a apple field. It had apple orchards, trees along the football field. So it pretty much was like a 100-yard open field. It wasn't a stadium. It didn't even have any stands. The parents and the fans would come. They would just stand on the sidelines. They wouldn't even sit in the stands. And it was called the Orchard. And here's him describing the football field, you know, during his time. Our football field was located in an apple orchard 1.5 miles from school. It was no easy task walking that distance every night after a strenuous practice session. The freshman members of the team lined the playing field and cleared away the stray apples on Saturday mornings before the games. Regardless of how careful we were to remove the fruit from the ground, we always missed a few. I got juice squirted into my eyes dozens of times falling on those apples. So just imagine, you know, we got a nice football field over here, but playing on an orchard field with just a leather helmet. You see the leather jersey over there, and just falling on the apples and stray apples. But that's how they played, and that's all he knew, you know. So, and one of his first football mentors was Charles Weldon, and Charles Weldon was a former graduate of Wheaton High School who came back and became coach, and he coached Red his junior and senior year. And just like George Halas later with the Bears, Weldon was probably his first real true mentor because he had played in college what is now Western Michigan, which is in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And so he came back and he coached Red even better than in his freshman and sophomore year, you know, because he knew the game a little bit more. He knew a little more of the technique. He helped Red, especially with his passing. You know, he would give him, you know, some footballs and say, hey, after class or on the weekends here, you know, work on your passing a little bit more, which the other coaches weren't doing at the time and stuff. So that's why Red's level of play in his junior and senior year sort of took off, and you see those crazy scores and those crazy plays that he did and stuff. So that was part of his growth as a player here in Wheaton, you know, which I think a lot of times gets overlooked, you know, because he was such a great star and All-American at University of Illinois. He was a great star, with the Chicago Bears and in pro football. But, here in Wheaton, is where he sort of got that start, and I hopefully that comes across in the book a little bit of some of those chapters is, that's why I kind of developed and didn't just gloss over, oh, well, he was a great player in high school and then he went to the University of Illinois, because people want to talk about Illinois, but here in Wheaton, he actually was a really great player and he learned the game, so when he got to college, Zupke was his coach at the University of Illinois. He could tell as a freshman. Freshmen were ineligible at the time. So if you're in sports and you playing as a freshman, back in the day, all freshmen were ineligible. You didn't play varsity sports and stuff. So he played on the freshman team, and the University of Illinois didn't even play games. Some colleges, even though they might play other freshman teams, but at the University of Illinois, their main role was to practice against the varsity and make the varsity better. And when he played, Zupke, his coach, could see it. He was like the best player on the field. He's like, who is this guy? And he's running through the varsity as an 18-year-old, and he could tell, oh, wow, next year I'm going to have this really good player, and you could see it. So, but it all started, here in Wheaton. One of the other things I definitely wanted to talk about a little bit, and it makes me so happy that Janice Franks is here. She is part of the Thompson family, and in Wheaton at the time when Red was a sophomore in high school, he was clowning around with his buddies on a street corner. And Mr. Thompson, who owned the ice company here, you probably younger people don't know, but before electric refrigerators, they would actually deliver ice to the homes, so every day, and usually you had ice every day. So every day somebody would lug 50 pounds of ice, 75 pounds of ice, 100 pounds of ice to the houses, and that would almost be, 7 days a week, and you would need ice. Well, Red was clowning around, and Mr. Thompson, L.C. Thompson, who owned the company, wanted to challenge these kids. He's like, oh, I'm just going to, have a little fun with them. He's like, if anybody can lift one of these 75-pound cakes of ice, I'll give you $1. So knowing that, these 13 and 14-year-old kids couldn't lug of 75 pounds of ice, but he didn't know Red Grange. And so Red Grange had a little bit of familiarity with the ice picks that you use. So he picks it up, he lugs it up on his shoulder, and Mr. Thompson's like, what is this kid doing? And he was just stunned, and he, shortly after that, he offered, Red Grange a job as an iceman, and he's a sophomore in high school, and he offered him, I believe it was $37 a week. I think it was $37.50 a week, which back then that was actually a good salary, and so Red was like, okay, I'll do that as, in the summertime, and he was able to make some money to help his dad, and also have a little bit of money for himself, but he actually treated it as a training sort of method, There was no weight rooms, there was no weights, like a lot of the kids, they just had jobs and they would go play football, they didn't have training programs and stuff like that. So, but he, like I said, smarter than the average freshman and sophomore, he saw this as a way of building himself up. He's walking up steps, he's lugging, the 75 and 100 pounds of ice, and he could see that it was developing his body, his developing his legs, and things like that. So, and I'll read another short passage. And you could tell, and this was during, in the 1950s, Red wrote his autobiography. So this is, 25 years after he sort of, stopped playing a little bit, and so just imagine, him thinking of this, of the way he, worked as an iceman, It is an accepted fact that the most important parts of a football player are his legs. Keeping those legs in shape represents the biggest single responsibility of a boy interested in playing football. While working on a road gang, laboring in the coal mines or steel mills is good for general muscle development, it contributes nothing towards a player's legs and conditioning. One stands still when working at those jobs and doesn't use his legs. Delivering ice, which required my walking miles every day up and down stairs, keeps me in all-around fit trim and provides the best possible off-season training for my legs. Reporting for football in the fall after a summer on the ice truck, I would be tough as nails and at least 4 weeks ahead of the other boys in conditioning. My iceman duties made my arms, shoulders, and legs strong and developed my wind. It was in effect my own private brand of spring training. My job on Luke Thompson's ice truck filled the bill to a T. So he wrote his autobiography in like 1953. So that's something now that I would think of. This is 2019. Oh, yeah, I'm thinking of getting better as a football player. I'm going to work out. I'm going to get better physically. I'm going to lift weights. I'm going to get stronger. So in 1953, he was thinking of this even before. So it's pretty amazing that he was thinking, oh, you know what? I'm 20, and he started in high school, and I'm 16, 17, 18 years old. I can build my body this way, which most guys weren't even thinking about that. They were just thinking about playing. Like I said, he was 4 weeks ahead of everybody because he had worked on the ice truck, and he was much further along. So that helped him, as a player and stuff. So I'm so happy because the Thompson family, which in some of the previous written material on Grange, it kind of gets glossed over, the impact of Mr. Thompson and what he did for Red. And they just mentioned that he owned the company and, he hired Red. But I was able to get a little bit more of what Mr. Thompson did and what he meant to Red and what he did, for his career. And sort of when I was here a couple years ago, I tried to retrace the route that he took a little bit too. And as you guys, especially some of the students, actually one of the houses that the Thompsons owned on Union Street still has one of the ice garages that you could tell, a gentleman who owns that house was very nice to me because I was like scoping out his house, and he was like, can I help you? And I'm like, oh, I heard this. And so he was really nice to show me this garage, and you could tell it's got a big garage, and then there's like a level on the top where they used to store the ice, and then they would bring the ice down, and they would, and he said, yeah, trucks would just come in there, and so it's a nice little piece of history there on East Union Avenue, just a couple blocks away. So, so that's very interesting, for this community. So, but Red, a couple, two more things I thought I would like to talk about, for Red is. Especially with this fall, if you're aware of, the Bears are celebrating their 100th season, and the NFL's celebrating their 100th season. And one of the threads that I wanted to develop was that, especially for the legacy of Red, is how he sort of became the blueprint of what the modern athlete, especially the modern NFL player, does today. The generation now only knows NFL players as being the most popular players in the world, and they make the most money, and they're the most visible. The Tom Brady's, the Cam Newtons, the Peyton Mannings. But back in the early 20s, pro football was sort of on the last rung of popularity. Baseball was number one. You had boxing, you had golf, you even had tennis, and even horse racing was much more popular. It was a tad above, professional wrestling at the time, But in 1925, when Red turned professional, when he left the University of Illinois, he put in motion sort of what the blueprint of what the athlete could do. Although it was 100 years ago. He left after his senior year, which would actually be leaving early. He signed with an agent. He was the first player to ever have an agent. He did endorsements. He did Hollywood movies. He won NFL championships. He made All-Pro, and he was the highest salary. So nowadays, when you look at those type of athletes, that's what they do now. If you're, Jalen Hurts at Oklahoma, and you're the starting quarterback at Oklahoma, you're going to leave school early. You're going to sign with an agent. You're going to sign endorsements. You're going to play for a rookie salary. You might make All-Pro. You might win the Super Bowl. So in 1925, Red was doing that, and that's what I've tried to tell about his legacy. And then when he retired, he sort of does the same thing in your post-career. So when he was done playing, he became a coach. He coached with the Bears as an assistant. Then he went into radio, and then he went into TV. TV was just getting started, and games were being on TV. He became a Hall of Fame. He was a charter member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame the first year they opened. Then he became an ambassador for the sport, and he helped get pension for former players. So when you see somebody like Tony Romo, he retires. He can go into coaching. He can go into TV. He can be an ambassador. Becomes a Hall of Famer. Well, Red did that too, So he sort of, and that's why I thread that through his legacy. He does it as a player, and he also does it as a post-career, and especially as a player, it's most impressive because he did it almost 100 years ago. Where now it's all commonplace. Oh yeah, you do this and you do that as a player, and then you retire, you go into TV, or you go, and do that. So that's very impressive for him. One of the last things I wanted to talk about was in 1978, Red was invited back to Wheaton. To make a long story short, Red's dad was a chief of police here in Wheaton for many years, a couple decades, and he sort of got screwed out of his pension, and it was a big thing, some political stuff, and Red did not like that, so he's like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to come back to Wheaton, because of how they were treated his father. Then in the mid-'70s, there was a man named D. Ray Wilson, and he was a publisher of the newspaper, and he was wanted to honor Red and honor some people who had done stuff for DuPage County. They were starting the historical gallery here at the museum, and they wanted to honor Red, and somehow, some way, he convinced Red to come back, and his main sort of thrust was you're a role model for the young kids, you're a role model for DuPage County and Wheaton, And Red sort of took that to heart and was like, okay, I'll come back. So there was this famous homecoming weekend, here in Wheaton, where he came back for, 3 days. He spoke to the old elementary school that he went to, which is Longfellow. He spoke at a couple high schools. They dedicated the field, which now is at Wheaton Warrenville South High School now. And they had a big celebration, an evening with Red Grange, which was actually at Edmund Chapel, here on campus. So anytime you go in the Edmund Chapel, you say, hey, Red spoke, and he spoke there, and they had the big event there. So it was a huge little big event that, and I was going to talk about a tree in Memorial Park, but when I walked over there, I saw that they're redoing Memorial Park. And I don't know if during this weekend, he actually planted a tree there. It was a red maple tree. And so when I was here doing research, I walked down there for the first time, and I saw it, and it was a huge tree, and there's actually a little brick there that says Red Grange Tree, October 28, 1978. That's when they planted it. He dug the first dirt, and I believe they actually have torn it down. So, but I still hope they didn't, because it's blocked off. You can't go in there. I talked to the manager because I was like, oh, what's happened to the trees? And so hopefully it was preserved, or the brick, but because there was a quote that he said, when you walk by this tree and say hi, you're saying hi to me. And I always thought that was very, heartfelt, when he did it. And like when I was here, like I said, in 2016, I felt Red was there, and so I was like, okay, this is neat. So I'm hoping they keep the tree, or at least keep the brick, and maybe, because I heard some of those things are going to replant trees, so maybe we'll get a new Red Grange tree, but hopefully we'll see. So, but those were some of the things that I was going to talk about, especially with his relationship here to Wheaton, and although he stayed away for a little while, he always really appreciated coming back and talking about Wheaton and being a part of this community and stuff. So, like I said, for me to come back and be able to talk about him a little bit, share some of the stories, with you, it's always nice. So, so I thank you for listening to me. So. We have time, we have plenty of time for any questions, so feel free. Like I said, I'm an open book, so to speak.
We're going to put it, so if you'll ask a question, if you'll ask it into the microphone, so that we're recording it, so that we can put it up on the college's YouTube and other things.
Do you feel that at the end of the day, was Red's animosity towards Wheaton reconciled? Did he have a good relationship with his hometown, or was he still angry?
No, absolutely. He loved it. I think it was more of he wanted to protect his dad. Because he lost his mom early. I think that was his best friend. His dad was his best friend, so he kind of like stuck up for him. But that's why when I was writing the book, there's a whole chapter on that 1978, because nobody has written about it really, and they just say, oh, he came back, and it was, and they brush over it. But reading the articles from that weekend and talking to some of the families, Vicki Harrington's here, her family actually hosted Red. He did not stay in a hotel. He didn't want the hoopla. He wanted to be, so he stayed with the Wilson family. And she told me the stories, and he just loved that weekend. And he said he probably wished he'd come back earlier. When he came back to Florida, he was retired at Florida at the time. He actually wrote Mr. Wilson a letter, that I present in there, that he put in the newspaper. That it was a heartfelt letter that Red wrote personally, saying thank you. It was great. I couldn't believe people were so excited about meeting me, and so. So no, he was definitely at peace. And he probably should have came back a little bit earlier, but at the time he loved being back and being part of it. So,
2 questions.
Sure.
Was Red his birth name? And the second question is, do you know where he's buried?
Okay. First question, Red was not his first name. Red was his nickname because of he did not have red hair per se. He had auburn hair. His brother, Garland, actually had like flaming red hair, but Red had auburn hair, but his first name was Harold. His name was Harold Edward Grange, and and I can see for, if you're 5 or 6 years old, Harold does not roll off the tongue very easily. So young kids just started calling him Red. He just let's call him Red because Harold Edward is not an easy name to say as growing up. So do I know where he's buried? He is not buried. He was cremated. So his ashes, I write about in the book, came out of the process. His ashes were actually spread at University of Illinois. So that was his wish.
I have a question about our late president, JFK, because his father was involved with producing movies in Hollywood. We were told as boys that our president, who had the reputation of being above heroes, didn't have his boyhood hero was Red Grange because through his father in Hollywood he was able to meet them or meet him. Is that true?
It is. Joseph Kennedy is the father.
Yes.
He at some point he was wealthy at the time, so he went and bought a studio, which was called RKO Studios.
Yes.
And Red wanted to get into films mainly through his manager, who was a Hollywood theater owner. So they eventually got to Joseph, and Joseph, yeah, I'll finance the films. And so he financed his first 2 films. They were silent films at the time. And so, yes, Jack and Bobby Kennedy's father is the one that sort of steered and made the films that so that is true. Yeah.
And another quick question, and that is, as we heard as boys, that when asked who the greatest running back that he knew was, he credited his dog named Jack because as a boy he would try to corner him in the fence in his backyard, and then he said he absorbed his moves and put him on the field.
Yep. He learned from everything.
And if I just may, one comment. You said that you walked the path that he would walk from the school, and you said Wheaton Central. Wheaton Central did not exist. It was K through 12 at Longfellow.
At Longfellow, yes.
That existed until 2001. And one of the heartbreaks as a town grows and a one high school town becomes 2, the boundaries. So the historic area that was predominant for his student population in his day, those kids that grew up in those neighborhoods, as I did, were denied that heritage, even though I walked the same path the football field walked, team walked to Jesse Wheaton's apple orchard.
I think you have one.
There must be a story behind the nickname.
Oh.
There must be a story behind the nickname Galloping Ghost. Do you have one?
Well, that one's a little tricky because I tried to find as much as I could. He was given the nickname Galloping Ghost. He always claimed that Warren Brown gave him the nickname, which was a sports writer for the Chicago Herald. And so in a couple of articles, he said, oh, no, Warren Brown gave him the nickname. So I went through all the newspapers to see if he wrote Galloping Ghost. Joe Zimba's here, who's helped me with microfilm research. We tried to find every game. I'm like, okay, that's one thing I want to find, because he always said that Warren Brown gave him the nickname. Now, the most famous sports writer at the time was Grantland Rice. And Grantland Rice wrote a poem that says A Galloping Ghost, which is the most well-known poem of the nickname. But that came later, But Red never said Grantland Rice gave him the nickname. He says Warren Brown. But I could never really find Warren Brown. So I don't know if Warren Brown said it like to his face or to public, and then it just, Grantland or whatever, So there's a little bit of it, but Grantland Rice is the one that wrote the most famous using the nickname, and then it took off after that. Then everybody else wrote after Grantland wrote it. Then everybody else used the nickname. So, yes.
Make a film on his life and show us?
We have not done one at film, so we did a show in 2002 about him.
You gonna rerun it?
I mean, that's 17 years ago. I mean, I don't have it with me, no. It could be on it, but I mean, that would take some doing. So it would be, yes, to see some footage of him. So yeah.
What was behind Red Grange leaving the NFL after 1 or 2 years and going into this new league or the team, the Yankees? What was that about?
Okay, so when Red decided to go play pro football and make some money because his name was very popular, and he went on a barnstorming tour with the Chicago Bears in the fall of 26 and in January of 26, or fall of 25, January of 26. Well, when he turned pro, he signed with an agent. His name was C.C. Pyle, and he signed a contract with Pyle. He did not sign a contract with the Bears. He just signed with Pyle to be his manager for 3 years. And so, but they hired the Bears because they didn't want to hire their own team. The Bears were built in. He knew everybody, so they went on the tour. So at the end of the tour, Pyle went to negotiate with George Halas and Dutch Sternman, who were the owners of the Bears. So instead of saying the same contract, we'll split, the income and the game income. Pyle wanted ownership of the team. He wanted third ownership of the team. Well, Halas, especially Halas, said, no way, no way, no way, you're not getting the team. So Pyle said, okay, I'm going to do the next best thing. We're going to start our own team. So in the owners' meetings the next year, in the offseason, he goes to the NFL and says, I want my own team, and I want it in New York. Well, the New York Giants are already there, and they were there the year before, and Tim Mara, who the Mara family still owns the Giants, had territorial rights, because that was the thing to have a franchise, is you could be protected. So he needed to approve that, and Mara said no, because everybody will go to see Red Grange play, and nobody's going to see the Giants play. So, and Pyle was not the most likable guy, because he wanted all the money. He wanted to, hey, we're the biggest. We got the biggest star. So since he got turned down by the NFL, he's like, we're going to just start our own league. So he started what was called the American Football League in 1926. He played as the New York Yankees, and they had 8 teams. And because the NFL was a little bit further along and had a little bit more, thoughtful people running the organization, the AFL failed after 1 year. 4 of their teams didn't even finish the year. They ran out of money and we're done, So that's why he went and started his own team, because Pyle wanted the part of the franchise, and Halas and Sternman said no.
So I read your book cover to cover, loved it. One thing that I saw from Red's family of origin, it seemed that Lyle and his siblings all had pretty strong religious background, which fits right in with the nature of the town of Wheaton. I'm just wondering how that played in with the rest of Red's life. Did he remain religious? Was he?
Well, Red was I would say, he wasn't rigid, or he wasn't dedicated. He grew up Methodist. So I think he did that a little bit, but because he was traveling, I think because his life got a little bit more crazy, and it was all over the place. Like say he was doing movies, he's traveling, he's playing football, but him, and especially when Margaret came in his life and he got married, they did observe their faith, but I don't think it was a huge part of okay, I'm doing this, because you got to think, especially for the most part during the football season, he's traveling. I mean, he's doing college games on Saturday, he's doing NFL games on Sunday, and then he's coming back and he's doing the Bears TV show on Monday, and he's doing his radio stuff. So a lot of times, I think it was more personal for him. It was more, his faith was more personal than some of his families. Some of his other families went and did other things. There was one that went out to Oregon and stayed, that's all he did, and stuff. So, with the faith and stuff. So for him, I think it was more personal. He knew what he believed. He knew what faith was he wanted to do, and he sort of followed that. So.
Sorry, sir, I came in a little bit late, but back in the day when he was playing, coming out of high school, did colleges actively recruit players as they do now? Reading about his, shall we say, sensational high school career here. So he could have gone, in today's world, any college he wanted to go to. And then as a second follow-up, in reading about after he signed with the Bears, I saw the gruesome schedule that they played of games. And, they were playing 5 games in 10 days or less. What happened to his body? And at the end of just a few years, because they were playing games almost back-to-back, day-to-day there, when he first started.
Absolutely, yeah. Your first question, most colleges in the Roaring '20s, they didn't actively recruit as we know it. You know, I think it's tough to gauge how active, you know, most teams, but most schools, especially like in Red's case, you almost were more local. You didn't really go away to college. You know, like he was in Wheaton, so University of Illinois was the most local team. You know, maybe you went to another Big Ten team, but you didn't have the, oh wow, I'm going to go out and play, you know, in California. I'm going to go play Texas or Miami like you do today. So the logical thing for Red was to go to especially the state university, which was cheaper too, you know, because his dad didn't make that much money as a police chief, so he wanted to go to the cheapest place. Now, for Red specifically, like Bob Zucke was his college head coach, he hated recruiting. He wasn't going to, you know, stoop down and recruit kids. He thought, my program's good enough. And I think some of them were like that. You know, you had Stagg at the University of Chicago, you know, Pop Warner, you know, those type of guys like, oh, my program's big enough, I'm going to get tons of kids that want to come. You know, a lot of kids from Chicago, you know, had a lot of good high school programs in Chicago. Oh, I'm going to go to the University of Illinois, I'm going to go play for Bob Zucke. You know, the only action, or the only interaction that Red had with Zucke was at a high school track meet in the spring of his senior year. He met, that was one thing Zucke went to, because the track meet was at the University of Champaign, or at the University of Illinois in Champaign. So the high schools would all go there. You had the big state track meet, and Red was lightning fast. He's like, oh, who's this kid? And he talked to him for like 2 minutes and said, you might do well here. That was his only interaction with Red. That was his only recruitment. He said, you might do well here. And so Red said, okay, he went, you know. So now you go, you know, you got to compete with 5 other schools, and you got coaches sitting in the, you know, the living room trying to convince the mom, and hey, but back then it just, you know, he went to the track meet, that was it, you know. So your second question, yes, the barnstorming tour, you know, which is very famous in NFL history because it put the NFL on the map, you know, because he traveled all across the country. Newspapers, newsreels, and radio covered the entire tour, and the NFL was on the front page of newspapers, but it was a daunting tour that probably shouldn't even been tried, you know, to that scale. Because, like you mentioned, I believe they ended up playing 5 games in 8 days, you know, at one stretch, you know, and some of them were back-to-back days, and it's not like baseball. And, you know, and by the end of the first tour, he had an elbow that was like 3 times the size, and he actually missed the last 2 games of the first tour before they went down south and out west. You know, he had to miss the games because he's physically unable to play, you know, because he played all these games trying to go to big crowds and trying to make as much money, you know. And when they went down south and down west, Pyle learned his lesson a little bit more. Like, he spread the games out. You know, there was like a week in between each games. They only played back-to-back days twice when they did those tours. So his body did break down. He did not finish the first tour. He missed the last 2 games of it, and then he had the rest, you know, before they went down south. So. How old was he retired? He retired, let's see, 31. He played through 1934 was his last year, and I think he would have been around 31 years old when he retired, which actually, for the NFL, was actually an older player. You know, usually you only played, you know, 3 or 4 years, and then you moved on to your, what we call your life's work. Now players can play a little bit longer, although I believe the NFL career is still only about 4 years for the average player, but you can play a little bit longer. But back then, even playing into your 30s, that's a long time. If you played more than 3 or 4 years, you were starting to, you know, actually build a really good career. So.
He considers going against Michigan his greatest?
He did it in college, yes, and probably overall. You know, he didn't like to toot his horn, so sometimes you can't get it out of him what he thought was the best. But because that was his marquee game, and people always brought it up, he always said that's probably his great. But he also always would compliment his linemen. He's like, oh, the lineman blocked great that day. Anybody could have ran through those holes, and anybody could have scored those touchdowns. But That's a little hard to believe. Maybe they score one, but they don't score. If you don't know quite as much of that game, in 1924, his big game that put him on the map, he scored. Illinois played the University of Michigan, and they were both undefeated the year before, but they didn't play. So this was like, who's the best team in the Big Ten? And he scored 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes. One on the opening kickoff. One was like 67, 55, and 47 yards, all in the first 12 minutes. Against probably the best team in the Midwest, and he ended up running for one more in the second half, and he threw one, and they crushed Michigan. And everybody's like, "Who's this guy from the Midwest that scored 5 touchdowns against Michigan?" And so that's what that game is.
One more follow-up. Did Jim Thorpe and him ever meet with the barnstorming or any of that? Did they ever play?
Yeah. Jim Thorpe was actually the first big pro star, but that was his best years were before the NFL was founded. So Red was like the first superstar. But they did play one game against each other, and it was on the Barnstorming Tour. It was down in Florida. I think Jim Thorpe might have been like 37 years old. He was well past his prime. And it was built as old against new. They played down in Florida, and Thorpe fumbled twice early in the game. They ended up taking him out. And Red would say, yeah, he was past his prime, so I didn't get to see the great one. And that was the only time they actually played against each other. So. Oh, we have one.
Studied at the University of Illinois?
Pardon?
His discipline of study?
He was general studies. Like I said, he wasn't the biggest fan of school. So he had a general studies curriculum.
Did not graduate.
Yeah, because he left after his senior season was done. He was several credits short, and he did not go back. So, but they always embrace him. But he not that he didn't take his schooling seriously. He just was not. He's just like, you know what, I'm going to classes. I'm in general study. He didn't want to be a business major or history or something like that. He just took the classes. And like I said, I might have mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned it, he did flunk 2 classes at the University of Illinois that he had to make up here at Wheaton College during the summer to be eligible. So he actually did take classes here to get himself eligible. So that's what he did as a student. So, and I do his grades. I had to. You actually can ask for people's grades cards after a certain time, like it's been 90 years. So I did get his grades, and they were okay. They weren't great. He's probably more of a C student at the University of Illinois. A little bit better at Wheaton High School. I found his grades. He was more of a B+ student at Wheaton High, more of a C at the University of Illinois. So.
Will you join me in thanking Chris for his time?
Thank you for listening to me. Like I said, I can babble all day about him and stuff, so because I just think he's such an interesting guy. But I appreciate you coming out and listening to me. So.
If you haven't yet, again, Special Collections has a few of the pieces of memorabilia there. There's a little bit of food in the back. And the books are here if you didn't yet have an opportunity, if you want to get a book and then have Chris sign it. We've got the books here. Thank you again. I'm so thrilled to see all you. Thank you.